Hello everybody! Today I wanted to talk about the Atlanta in War Thunder Naval because in my opinion this is the ship that shows the biggest difference between World of Warships and War Thunder Naval, because in World of Warships this ship is well known as being a free kill for the most part. Everywhere you hit on this ship you can get massive damage. It has to sit behind islands and use its high firing arcs to shoot over them. It's known to just sit there and spam high explosive until somebody with an armor piercing round looks its way. And generally it's kind of known as a meme ship, at least as far as when I was playing. But in War Thunder Naval, this thing is completely different. For its tier, this thing dominates. It is a extremely dangerous and fairly survivable ship that doesn't just disappear once something randomly looks at it. That's the other American heavy cruisers. This thing for a light cruiser is absolutely awesome in my opinion. And in War Thunder it's just a tech tree ship. You don't have to pay money to get this thing and find out that, yeah, if you sail around and something looks at you, you disappear. In War Thunder, you research it and then you just go absolutely dominate the matches you are in, because this thing is impressive. It doesn't have to rely on islands and smoke to survive. It sits at a battle rating where it mainly just sees other light cruisers and destroyers, but at the worst it can see some late war heavy cruisers or early dreadnoughts, and in some cases it absolutely shreds those too. This thing is just all about an extremely dangerous ship, and it's nothing like World of Warships. I know I said that already, but it just really impresses me that it shows the difference with this ship in particular. As far as the nitty-gritty as to how this ship is actually better than its World of Warships counterpart, the first thing I wanted to talk about was the armor on this thing. I mentioned before, World of Warships, if you happen to even look at this ship with a higher caliber HE round or an armor piercing round from basically anything, you were getting a Citadel, and that ship was basically toast because it couldn't take a lot of them. It was very flimsy, it was lightly armored, everything counted as a Citadel. It was a meme for the most part. But in War Thunder, it actually has fairly survivable armor. Its armor plating can take hits from some destroyers and, well, most destroyers and some light cruisers, and completely negate the damage. I know fighting a lot of them with my Japanese line, I would shell them and there'd be one armor segment that would just absolutely eat up every one of my shells every time and would just frustrate me when I was fighting this ship, leading me to end up targeting its guns first or something like that, just because I couldn't actually get into the engines or stuff like that due to how my shells were arcing down on it. And like I said before, it's not all counted as a Citadel. Due to War Thunder's compartmentalization and damage models, you can damage its engines, but it's not just going to lose 90% of its health points. In War Thunder, you can hit individual engines, you can hit individual turrets, you can try to find the ammo on this thing, but I've never really had a lot of luck on it. And each individual part may be damaged, but it's not just going to completely nuke the ship, short of an ammo detonation. Along with that, in War Thunder, it has almost double the crew of most destroyers, so it makes it very survivable for most of the ships that it can see. It really only starts lacking when you're facing stuff like heavy cruisers in the late war, or dreadnoughts that you have trouble penetrating and fighting back against, because those will start to get through your armor and will start to really chip away at those crew numbers. In a similar vein to World of Warships though, it doesn't take torpedo hits very well. This thing is built for speed, it has no torpedo protection. It's just a big destroyer that when you do find a torpedo and it happens to hit under your very numerous turrets, you'll just flat out get detonated for the most part, short of getting extremely lucky. And you'll probably see that in the replay in the background, because I really forgot that I need to move around a little bit more to keep the destroyers from torpedoing me. And, you know, it was basically their main way of taking me out. And I will admit the replay in the background is a bit of seal clubbing, It was a very low-end match where I was top tier that War Thunder put me in, and I think my biggest threat was a Detroit at the beginning, an Omaha class basically, that the Atlanta absolutely shredded, and I really don't think he did a lot of damage back to me, so it is a bit of seal clubbing as far as War Thunder goes. But there is another big difference between War Thunder's Atlanta and World of Warships Atlanta. In World of Warships, this is a huge no-fly zone. All the dual-purpose main battery mounts, all the miscellaneous anti-air guns that it has on it, all count towards World of Warships anti-aircraft defense number. I forget what it's really called. But in War Thunder, since each gun is controlled on its own, or AI controlled, or stuff like that, you really don't get the full breadth of this thing's anti-aircraft defense if you're also fighting other ships at the same time, because you're not able to bring your main batteries into the fight against the aircraft due to A, having to load a completely different shell for them to be mostly useful, and B, you'd actually have to raise your main batteries and stop shooting at the enemy ship in order for them to take out the plane. Luckily, this thing does have 3 quad 1.1 inch guns that put in some absolute work for swatting planes out of the sky. Early on, I thought this thing basically had no anti-aircraft defense and you'd have to fully rely on the main batteries to swat planes, but I think this has one of my bigger plane kill amounts in game, just because those 1.1 inch guns have a really good fire rate, good arcs of fire, and when they do hit a plane it tends to rip parts off of them very quickly. So while it's not the no-fly zone short of you trying to dedicate your main batteries to taking out a plane, it's still very effective, and really short of a very determined aircraft that comes in just perfectly, I think you'll tend to take down most planes even if they take you down as well. Now, this ship does get a smokescreen for cover if you do need to, but unlike in World of Warships, in War Thunder this is a defensive option, as when the enemies can't see you, you typically can't see them, so the smokescreen completely blankets your ship, and you'll have free time to repair short of the enemies actually guessing your position and being pretty good with their aim, which you don't see too often. So it's a very defensive option versus something like the Flint in World of Warships, where you just pop your smoke and you continuously shell the enemy ship that now can't see you, but you can see them. As far as maneuverability, since this is part of the ship's survivability in my opinion, this thing is very fast, and for the length and thinness of its ship, it does maneuver well, but since you're coming straight from destroyers into this, it really doesn't throw itself around like a destroyer, and it's a struggle to get used to if you're not used to the bigger ships already, and so sometimes you'll tend to take more torpedoes than you would think because you're not used to the turn time on this ship. And the other downside to how fast and thin this thing is that it lists very heavily when you're doing a sharp turn, to the point where your guns either A, won't be able to fire over one side of your ship, or if it's listing down on the side of the ship you're shooting over, it may heavily throw off your aim to the point where you're shooting well below or well above the enemy ship just because of the listing of your own. And it does take a little bit to right itself after a hard turn, so it can throw off your aim fairly aggressively and for a decent length of time if you do make such a hard turn while you're engaging something. Now, as far as the firepower on this thing goes, because it was a main feature of it in World of Warships that it had such an impressive fire rate and you could just sit there and spit out shells for the entire match, it does withhold its high rate of fire, and it's absolutely lovely when you get to these fights with destroyers and stuff where you're just mowing them down with all your 5-inch gunfire. And like World of Warships, you can fire them one at a time to have that rainbow effect of your shells, and this is especially helpful if you're trying to dial in your aim on something that's a little bit further away, or you think they're going to maneuver, you can just have this continuous hose of shells coming out of your ship to just decimate them and rip off all the weapons off their deck and make it so that they can't fire back at you. But at the same time, with that rate of fire that you do have, you can just salvo fire all your shells, and in I think 3 seconds your next salvo's up, your first shells haven't even hit your target yet, and you're already sending another on the way. So while it can be somewhat difficult to correct your aim when you're 2 or 3 salvos behind where you're actually hitting, when these things are on target, it's just devastating to enemy ships, and it helps you survive a lot better because you can aim for destroyer guns that are aggressing you. You can aim for cruiser guns and just completely rip all the weaponry off the enemy ships so that they can't fight back, and you're just working on their engines or their bridge or something like that in order to sink them before they can get everything repaired. Now, as far as the ammo in War Thunder is concerned, I know in World of Warships this was known as a high explosive spammer. It sat behind an island, fired high explosive, and set you on fire. In War Thunder, that's completely different. Both the high explosive and the armor piercing are extremely effective against basically everything that you see. It does start off with the high explosive, which absolutely farms most other enemy ships, but when you get the armor piercing, this thing really just unlocks everything. The armor piercing is very effective against destroyers and many light cruisers, and even when you get to see the heavier ships with it, like the late war heavy cruisers or the dreadnoughts, there's still many of those heavy cruisers that this is very dangerous to, because they don't have the rate of fire to fight back against you, and your shells are still finding a way inside of their hull and causing damage. You don't have to switch back to the high explosive just to deal with these bigger targets. I mean, if you're facing an Ikoma, which is an early Japanese battle cruiser or dreadnought, it just shreds it. It can do nothing to fight back against you. When I was grinding the Ikoma, this was probably my most hated enemy ship to face, and I'd go out of my way to avoid it for the most part, just because I couldn't fight back against it. As far as its other shell option that you do get, it does get a variable timed HE shell for use against aircraft, but like I was mentioning earlier, you do have to manually switch to this if you're using your main guns already, and then you have to bring your guns off the target that you were shooting at already, which these are fairly responsive guns, but you have to adjust them, come off of the ship that you were fighting, aim them up in the sky, and hope that you actually hit the aircraft or get close to it with your variable timed high explosive shells. In my opinion, it's just better to rely on those 1.1 inch guns sometimes and just let them do their work. You can take them over obviously and shoot down the plane yourself, which will speed up that kill time most likely, but I've always found it better just to keep your guns pointed at the enemy ships and just letting loose with the firepower you have. And also, like I just said, the main batteries are very quick and responsive to turns and maneuvers. If you wanted to switch your aim to an enemy ship, they're basically going to go right to the target immediately, and you won't have to sit there and wait for them to turn. The shell arcs aren't super long compared to what I was used to in World of Warships. They're still very long comparatively, but they're the same as the other US destroyers. They're not going to orbit first before they come back to hit your target. So in my opinion, very effective. It's not a guessing game if you're aiming at ranges like 10 kilometers, but it still does require more lead than some other ships. And the last thing I wanted to touch on is the other weaponry on your ship. The 1.1 inch guns that I have been mentioning as airplane swatters are also fairly effective against other ships. Whether it's engaging them on a destroyer because you can't move because you're flooding out, ask me how I know, or them just engaging on their own against stuff like patrol boats or torpedo boats or stuff like that, they do a fair amount of damage to those. And the other thing is the torpedoes on this. It gets 4 per side, and they aren't just a last resort. I know in World of Warships they were fairly short ranged. You had to basically They're used to prevent people from charging you down, or when you were charging a battleship that you couldn't damage in the first place. And in War Thunder, they're really not like that. They do max out at just over 9 kilometers of range, so it's a fairly decent distance, but they are fairly slow and they're not super effective. So while it will cause havoc to the enemy team to have these things go through, if they do hit something, in my opinion, it's kind of like getting hit with a wet noodle, and it might cause some flooding on them. That's about it. So while they are useful and I do keep them on the ship, they aren't like World of Warships where they're a last resort. You can actually fire them off into the enemy team and hope to get a little bit more damage out of it. Anyways, that's really the main differences that I wanted to highlight with this ship. I know it was a bit of a long talk about them, but hopefully you guys enjoyed. Hopefully you learned a couple of things. If you do want to try this ship, I absolutely suggest it. The American line is very fun and very good for beginners. And either way, good luck out there, and I'll see you next time.